Hello everyone, welcome to the GTAC Tech Talk webinar on Access Control Configuration Part 1, Doors, Areas, and Zones. Thanks for attending today. My name is Derek Schaefer. I am a Technical Training e-Content Specialist with Genetec, and I'll be your host for the webinar. We also have some of the other members of the Genetec Technical Assistance Center standing by who are assisting with the webinar questions and answers. Our first GTAC expert is Roger Neptune, who is one of our technical support engineers with the Access Control team. And we also have Scott McFall with us today to help with questions as well. Scott is an e-content specialist with the GTAC. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can just type them in the question box of the GoToWebinar console, and one of us will get back to you with an answer as soon as possible. In case we need to verify any information for your question, we'll make a note of it and get back to you via email as soon as we have an answer. All the questions and answers from the webinar will be posted on the GTAC Tech Talk section of the Genetec Technical Assistance Portal forums a day or two after the webinar has finished. If you have any additional questions or comments on the webinar or the GTAC Tech Talk webinar series in general, you can post them in this section of the GTAP forum as well. Now, all the videos of the previous webinars can be found by going to the Tools section, then Videos, and clicking on the GTAC Tech Talk section on the left here. There are two ways you can watch these, either streaming in a browser window by clicking on this icon right here, or you can download a zipped Windows media file by clicking on the second icon right here. If you would like to receive emails concerning the latest additions to the Genetec Technical Assistance Portal, you can log on into the GTAP, go to the My Account section, and click on Email and Notifications. From the notifications screen down here, you can check the boxes of the subjects you're interested in, and select how often you wish to receive emails about this subject. To put a checkbox next to a subject, the frequency will have to be set to daily or weekly, otherwise the options below it will be grayed out. You can also edit your subscription to our two Genetec newsletters in the email subscription section up here. And don't forget you need to hit the submit button on the bottom to save your changes. Before we get started, I'd just like to take a brief minute to look at the agenda for the webinar today. We're going to start out with a very short introduction, taking a look at the goal of the webinar and the basic structure of the Access Control System and Security Center. After that, we're going to go into creating and configuring doors in the system, followed by looking at the areas, including antipassback and interlocking. We're going to take a look at how to configure and use inputs, outputs, and zones. And to end it off, we'll go over the various components of batch templates and how to design one. Let's take a quick look at a little information about the webinar and what we're looking at today. First off, I'd like to talk about the goals and motivations for the webinar. We're constantly looking at the cases that are being opened at the Genetec Technical Assistance Center, and based on that information, we've come up with the next two webinars to cover the common access control topics we see. In some situations, we're seeing information requests and procedural questions, so we'd like to cover more configuration and setup information in today's webinar. Part 2 of this webinar will be presented in March, and in that webinar we'll be covering a few more advanced topics, like common troubleshooting tips that may be helpful, basics on wiring for access control units, and the global cardholder configuration that was originally introduced in Security Center 5.1. Alright, so configuring doors and access rules is great to know, but before we get into that, I want to take a brief look at the components of the Security Center Synergist Access Control module. When looking at access control, a lot revolves around the access rules. There are three main components to an access rule, which we refer to as the three W's: who, when, and where. The who is the cardholders and cardholder groups that are granted or denied access based on the access rule. The when is the schedule that is applied to the access rule, which defines the times and dates that the rule is active. And the where are the entities that are protected by the access rule, namely doors, elevators, and areas. Speaking of doors, schedules can also apply to them, to say when the door should be unlocked to everyone. These doors are controlled by the physical access control hardware units, which include readers, inputs, and outputs. Looking at the card holders over here, they can be considered individually for an access rule, or they can be included as part of a cardholder group. The card holders have credentials which are assigned to them, such as prox cards and PIN codes, and the card credentials can have badge templates assigned to them as well. Now, the whole thing usually takes a couple of days to go over, so we're limiting our topics today to just parts of the system, which I've got highlighted in blue here. Some of the rest will be covered in Part 2, or may be left for a future webinar if it requires more in-depth coverage. In particular, we're going to look over how to use the inputs and outputs related to a unit, but we're not going to go over the wiring of the unit until the next webinar. Similarly, we're going to touch on a few points on elevators, but we're primarily going to focus on doors with regards to configuration and use in access rules. Speaking of doors, we're going to take a look at the configuration and the various components first. Doors can be added from the logical view or the logical view section of the entity creation pop-up menu. The actual creation steps are pretty simple, and most options can be adjusted from the door properties or hardware tabs. Like most entities, we start by giving it a name, a description if needed, and we assign it to a partition. If you're going to be using partitions to restrict who can view and manage the door entity, we recommend setting this up ahead of time. If you need more information on partitions and security architecture, we have a webinar from October 2012 available on the GTAP for that subject. Now, under the door information, you see the names of the sides of the door. By default, it just calls them door side A and door side B, but you can rename those to something more relatable, such as outside and lobby. This will be important later on when we look at areas and need to specify which side is to enter the area and which one is to exit the area. From this screen here, we can also assign which access control unit the door is wired to. If you do choose a unit, it will then ask you to assign the hardware to the various door components. We'll go over these in a minute, but just bear in mind that this screen is for your convenience and nothing is set in stone. You can adjust all of these settings later on from the hardware tab of your door. Now, there are three kinds of door configurations, and some options in the hardware tab may not be needed for all those configurations. First one we have is card in and card out, which uses both readers on a door. We have card in and rex out, which uses one reader, and we have readerless doors as well. Readerless doors can't monitor who is using the door since there are no credentials being presented. These types of doors are typically used where one side is locked and inaccessible, but the other side has a request to exit, or rex, which is used to let people through. A good example of this would be the side exit at a concert hall. You wouldn't want people to enter from the outside, but after the concert has ended, people can use the side exit to leave. Now, taking a look at the hardware tab, let's go over what each option is used for. Now, starting with the preferred unit up here, this is the access control unit that will be shown by default when selecting a connection, and is usually the unit the readers are wired to. This is for convenience only, as you can still assign readers, inputs, and outputs without a preferred unit selected. You'll also be able to choose a connection from another unit even if you have a preferred unit selected. Now, moving on to our door sides here, this is the name or the location that we have given the reader in order to make it easier to identify. You can edit the value by clicking on the text itself and start typing, or click again to see a cursor for editing. The reader here is the physical input used for detecting credentials. The pencil icon next to it is for more options, such as the type of reader, or to use both a card credential and a PIN credential. We'll take a look at the card and PIN setup later on. Now, the request for exit field here can either be specified for the particular door side, or it can be assigned in general later on down here. Now, they both do the same thing, but you can assign it for a door side here for the sake of clarity. This is the input connected to the egress system, which can be a push button, a crash bar, or an infrared motion detector, just to name a few examples. Now each door side can have one or more cameras assigned to it, so that any door events will also bring the cameras up for viewing in a tile in the security desk. You may assign multiple cameras per door side, just clicking on clicking on this associated camera button to add more cameras. Now let's take a look down here at the additional connections section, starting with the buzzer. The buzzer is not the beeper on the unit, but it's a separate device that is wired to an output relay. You can use actions based on events to trigger the buzzer or to shut it off. The door lock here is the relay used to trigger the electronic lock on the door, which can be an electric strike, a magnetic strike, or other device. Below that we have the input that is connected to the door sensor, which tells us if the door is open or closed. As well, in the unit properties we can set up the input defaults, such as if it's normally open or normally closed, and if it's supervised or unsupervised. The manual station input is connected to an emergency release handle connected to the door, which should immediately unlock the door in case of emergency. If this is wired properly, this is done directly through the door controller. We have the input here just to monitor when it was done and to advise the operators that a manual release station was activated by turning the door icon yellow. Now, as I mentioned here, we have the general request to exit, and finally we can add additional connections if we have other door sensors, manual stations, or REX units connected to the door. Let's have a quick look at the basic door properties. The request for exit will leave until the end of this section of the webinar. Now, once the door has been given the OK to unlock, either through credential presentation or request to exit, the lock will stay open for a normal set amount of time. Some card holders may have special needs or require extra time to get through, such as a janitor with a cleaning card. In this case, we can check the option to use the extended grant time in the cardholder properties, like this right down here. The extended grant time is set up in the door properties, right here. In some cases, there are certain events you may want to monitor, such as if a door is being held open too long, or if the door is forced open without an access granted event preceding it. You can choose to activate these options right here. And for the door held open too long event, you can specify how long the door must be open before the event is actually triggered. The last option here is to unlock the door for maintenance. This is like an event mute button for the door and ignores all events generated by this door. This is a good thing to enable if there's a technician or other personnel working on the door and would be generating false events. In an environment where some doors will be unlocked for access part of the time, you can assign unlock schedules to the door. Looking at the Unlock Schedule tab, there are two types of schedules. On the left side here, we provide schedules when we want the door to be unlocked. On the right are the exceptions that will override those schedules. So let's take a look at a quick example here. Say we're setting up the front door leading to the office building lobby. We want people to be able to freely access the building without using a credential on normal business hours. So the first thing we would do is set up a weekly schedule that will keep the door unlocked between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. on normal business days. However, when there are holidays and the offices are closed, we don't want to just let anyone wander around the building, so we're going to set up exceptions for the major holidays. For this, we can create a specific schedule which only contains the holidays when the offices are closed. Since we are creating these as schedules, they can be reused in other Security Center entities, such as alarms and archivers. So going back to our unlock schedules, we're going to assign the office hour schedule to the unlock side to allow free access during that time. And on the exception side, we're going to add our major holiday schedule to restrict who can enter. Set up like this, if someone wants to come in on a holiday, they'll need to present their credential to a reader, which will grant or deny access based on the access rules it will create. Now, just a reminder of the schedule hierarchy. A more specific schedule will always override a more general schedule. So ranking them from highest priority to lowest priority, our highest is a specific schedule, then ordinal, weekly, daily, and our lowest priority and most general schedule is the always schedule. Alright, so we mentioned access rules previously. Now how do we set them up? The creation is pretty simple. Just go to the access rules section of the access control task and add an entity, or from any other task add an entity, expand the access control menu and choose access rule. The basic information section contains the entity name, the description, and the partition. Now under the access rule information, we need to choose an existing schedule, the when component of the access rule. If you don't have a schedule created yet, choose any schedule just to create the rule, and you can modify this later on from the access rule properties. Hit next to create it and you're done. So let's take a look at those properties right now. As we mentioned, there are three main components to an access rule: when, who, and where. We just set up the when component when creating the rule, but as I mentioned, you can always change that from the schedule drop-down menu right here. Now let's take care of the who and select which cardholders and groups are affected by this access rule. Under the cardholder list, click on the Add Entity sign and you can select cardholders. You can also change the entity type to select cardholder groups. Now once you have a set of cardholders selected, you'll need to decide how you want the access rule to affect them. You can either have the rule grant access to the selected customers, or you can set it up to deny access. In some situations, it may be easier to simply allow everyone access to a door and then specify the cardholders who should not have access to it. Just make sure the two lists aren't too large, or it may affect the time it takes to sync the units. Okay, so we have one last step, which is to specify the where affected by the access rules. And by this, we mean the doors, areas, or elevators. Now there's two ways we can set this up, either in the relationships of the access rule identity, or in the access rule tab of the door, area, or elevator. Now let's take a look at the relationship side first. So once you click on the doors, elevators, and areas relationship section, you'll get the Add Entity button on the bottom. When you click on it, you can search for an area, door, or elevator. As with other searches, we can specify the entity type, search for a specific entity name or description, or turn on other filters to narrow our search. You can use the Shift or the Control key to click on multiple entities, and hit the Select button when you have chosen the entities you want to add. If you have the doors, elevators, and areas relationship expanded, you'll now see the entities that were added listed there. Now the second way is adding the access rules from a door to a door from the door entity itself. So this is where we have the door selected, and then we go to the access rule tab. To add an access rule, just hit the Create button on the bottom of the list. Now when we're adding access rules to a door, you can choose to add a rule, or you can choose to add a cardholder or cardholder group. When adding a cardholder or cardholder group to a door, it acts like an access rule with only those people selected, and the rule is on an always schedule. This is only available for doors. For areas, you can only add access rules. So when you're adding an entity, once again you can search for a particular name, or you can select multiple entities by holding down the Shift or Control keys. For doors and areas, we can specify if we want to use the same rules for both sides of the door, or have separate rules for accessing each side of the door like we have turned on here. You might want to use this to make sure you don't trap someone behind a door. For example, let's say our access rule for a door only allows Bob access to the server room from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. If Bob walked in at 4:59 p.m. and did some maintenance for about 10 minutes, he wouldn't be able to get out again since the time is now outside of what has been allowed by the access rule. So in this case, we want to put a secure access rule on the door side going into the server room, and we could put the all open rule on the door side that is leaving the room. Now it's a little different for elevators when we're assigning access rules, where you choose the floors you wish to modify and then add access rules to that selection. You can then choose a different selection to add other rules, and all the rules on the floors that they've been associated to will show up in the list below the floor filter. Okay, let's take a brief look at using the card and pin for your door readers. Of course, for this kind of situation, you need a reader installed that has a keypad. By default, the reader will accept the card credential or the pin credential and allow access with either one. To see the configuration, click on the pencil icon next to the reader. From here, we can change the type of reader, and we can also select if we're using card and pin. If we do have this checked, it will require both credentials to be presented before unlocking the door while the schedule selected is valid. Outside of the schedule, it will only accept the card credential. Now, if you happen to have a keypad reader installed, but you don't want it to work with the pin credential, you can simply set it to use the card and pin and set the schedule to never. This way it will always be outside of the schedule and only ask for the card credential. In the case where you use a card or pin to unlock a door, make sure all your card holders have unique pin credentials. If you'd like to use a REX device on your system, the first thing you'll need to do is have an input selected from one of the 3 Request to Exit sections in the Door Hardware tab. From there, we need to click on the door properties to set up a few of the options in the Request to Exit section. First is the time to ignore the REX events after granting access. This can be used to cut down on any false requests and will not check the input for this long after access has been granted. If you're using a REX, you'll definitely need to turn on the next option, Automatically Grant Request to Exit. Similar to the ignore time, we can also tell the system not to check the REX if the door is still open. You need to have your door sensor set up in the hardware section for this. And finally, you can also delay the next use of the REX after the door has been closed, which is defined right here in the properties. Alright, so we're going to move on to areas now, and we're going to look at 2 of the area functions that are used the most, which are antipassback and interlocking. First, let's have a look at what an area is in general. Areas are groups of entities which can be used for organizational purposes or for access control. We can add many types of entities to an area, such as doors, elevator floors, cameras, zones, and other areas. And from an access control perspective, we can use areas for anti-passback, interlocking, and people counting. Now, the doors associated with an area can be considered perimeter doors, like these ones here, or they are captive entities, meaning they have no effect on the access control functions of the area. Area creation is fairly simple. You just need to specify a name for the area and the partition that it'll belong to. Now, there are many different kinds of entities that can be added as members to an area. When you hit the Add button in the Members area, it will ask you which members to add. You can filter it based on the name, description, or any other entity properties. If you take a look at the entity type filter, you can see all the different types of entities that can be part of an area. Now, the main ones we're going to be focused on are the doors, since we're using them for anti-passback and interlocking. So, for example, we're going to filter our search to add areas and doors. After hitting search on the bottom here, the list will update, and we can select multiple entities using the Shift and Control keys, and hit select down here to add them to the area. Once you've added some entities, you can see them in the members list here. They will be sorted by the entity type. Taking a look at the doors we've added, this is where we can define a door as captive or as a perimeter door. If you set one up as a perimeter door, you'll need to specify which side is the entrance to the area and which one is the exit. Now this is very important for anti-passback and people counting. If you need to reverse the entrance and the exit, just click on the arrow icon right next to it here. Okay, at this point we're going to have a look at configuring the access rules for the area. As we mentioned, the access rules only apply to perimeter doors and not to captive doors. So in our example here, the data center door would not be affected by the access rules we define. Just like we saw with doors, we can assign an all open rule for the exit in case the schedule goes inactive while somebody is in the area. Now areas are good for grouping doors and applying general access rules to them, like how a cardholder group works with privileges. Just a reminder that for areas, we can only add access rules and we cannot add cardholders or cardholder groups directly like we saw when we were adding access rules to doors. Now that we have our area set up, we're going to consider using the anti-passback function. Now a passback violation is when someone opens a door and passes their credential on to the person behind them to use again. Piggybacking is another situation where a second person will be able to enter an area due to the door being opened by a previous cardholder. Anti-passback is used to notify us of cardholders who are trying to enter an area while they're still listed as being in another area, or exit an area the system doesn't know they ever entered. We can even block their access or force user intervention in order to allow them to pass. Now one quick note, we can use anti-passback or interlock on an area, but we can't use both at the same time. Since entities can be associated with multiple areas, a possible solution to this is to create another area for the interlock with the same entity members. When using anti-passback, we need readers on both sides of the door, so we can tell who is coming in and who is going, and you wouldn't be able to tell that using a Rex. Now to make the overall access control system more secure, we can use physical devices such as turnstiles to limit access to one person at a time. Now let's take a look here under the access behavior at the different options that we have available. Soft anti-passback records the violation but still allows the person to pass. This is only for monitoring purposes, basically. Hard anti-passback blocks the person from entering an area until the violation has been manually cleared in the security desk by a user or an operator. The timeout value here is used to clear the violation status, but at the moment it cannot be used with the HID equipment and needs to be set to 0. Strict anti-passback here denies access to a person entering or leaving the area if they're in violation. Now, hard anti-passback with strict turned off will block the person from entering the area, but allow them to leave it. Due to general hardware restrictions, HID requires strict to be enabled when we're using hard anti-passback. Now, interlocks, which are sometimes referred to as man traps, are used on areas to only allow one door to be open at a time. Once one door is open, the other doors in the area are locked. We can also associate inputs to activate the override condition and also do a lockdown as well. In an override, all the doors are unlocked, and when you put a system into lockdown, all the doors to the area are locked and access is denied even to valid cardholders. Now right here we can set the priority on either the override or the lockdown condition in case both of the inputs that are selected here are active at the same time. Looking at the hardware diagram, we can see how all this is connected using a V1000 and some V100s, and we've got a V200 for the inputs here as well. Just remember that for control purposes, all the controllers must be connected to one V1000. Now we're going to take a look at the inputs and outputs on a unit and what they're typically used for, and we'll take a look at how to set up hardware zones as well. Taking a look at the input properties for a door controller, you'll see that we have a set of associated inputs and outputs. These refer to the actual connections on the physical unit itself. The AC fail input is used to monitor power failures on the unit. The bat fail is used to monitor the battery backup connected to the unit. The door monitor here is used to check the position of the door to see if it's currently open or closed. This can be set to one or the other by default, depending on how the monitor has been wired. The REX here, or request to exit, can be an infrared sensor, a button, or other device which is used to unlock a door without a reader. Now remember to select the automatically grant request to exit if used as a REX input and uncheck it for general use. The strike relay output is connected to the door lock. These are these two right here. And you'll notice there's an aux relay here as well. This can be used for a strobe light for notification purposes, or connected to a motor to open a door automatically when a button is pushed. Now we're going to go into more detail about connections and wiring in the second part of this webinar next month. There are a few restrictions I'd like to talk about related to the inputs and outputs and their use. Now going back to the AC fail here, if one is used on a V1000 controller or one of the interface panels attached to it, you can't use the input for anything else. If you use it for one, it reserves it for the AC fail usage for everything attached to that controller. This will not affect other V1000 controllers or the interface panels connected to these other controllers. If you have the monitor AC fail checked in the general settings of the unit properties, it will change the unit to yellow if it sees a problem. Now the tamper and the door monitor are two specific inputs that can only be used for their respective purposes and shouldn't be used for anything else. Now related to the rest of the inputs and outputs, in general try to use them for their respective purposes, otherwise the wiring at a site may get confusing. For example, don't use the AC fail for the REX if the REX input is already available. Now the buzzers and LEDs are known by the unit hardware for that specific purpose. So if they're wired to something else, they won't behave properly since the HID unit controls them and just receives a notification from us when to turn them on or off. Now just a side note here as well, if you're using the unit for an elevator, you'll need a separate V1000 or V2000 per elevator cab. Now also make sure that you're using firmware version 2.2.7.49.1, as higher firmware versions do not support elevator control. Taking a look at zones, in Security Center, zones are collections of inputs that are monitored and can be used to trigger actions upon state changes. Let's have a quick look at the major differences between a hardware zone and a virtual zone. Now first of all, looking at who controls the zone, in a hardware zone it's the unit that handles the input monitoring and links to the outputs. In a virtual zone, all the monitoring is done by Security Center. Considering the types of inputs, in a hardware zone we can only use the inputs on one specific unit, and that unit must be in mixed or offline mode. Virtual zones, we can monitor inputs from multiple devices, including inputs that are on encoders or IP cameras. Now here's where we see a big difference in how the zones are handled when the unit is not connected to Security Center. Now a hardware zone is controlled by the unit, so if it can't reach the Security Center server, it still has all its information stored on the unit, such as the schedule, and it can actually run offline. Looking at the virtual zones here, everything is done by Security Center, so it needs to be online to be able to monitor the inputs and perform the actions that are based on them. Now looking here at zone arming and disarming, this is something that we can only do with virtual zones from Security Center, as it's the one that controls the zone itself. For the arming and disarming in a hardware zone, it's done by an input or on a schedule. Alright, so when we're creating a zone, you'll need to specify the type of zone in the creation process, hardware or virtual. The regular zone here is considered a hardware zone. Now if you choose that zone, or a hardware zone, you'll need to specify the controlling unit, which is used to gather input and output information. After a hardware zone has been created, let's take a look at the properties. This is where we set up which unit will be used, right up here. You can change that if you need to. And which inputs will be monitored. Anything that's checked here will be monitored. We also have the operator on top to say if we want all the inputs active to go into an active state using the AND operator, and if we want one of the inputs to trigger the active state, which is the OR operator. So in this situation here, if any one of these becomes active, it will trigger the zone. Below that, we have our events associated with the changes to an active state or go back to a normal state. The trouble state will activate when any one of the selected inputs goes into a trouble state and overrides the other two state conditions. You can also set up things like arming the input and schedule from the arming tab here, and associate cameras to a zone as well. From the arming tab, you can specify a schedule or the input that will be used to arm the zone. You can also set an arming delay, which is the amount of time it will wait before the event triggers become active after arming the system, and an armed grace period, which will delay the triggering the events for the specified time after the input is tripped. Basically, you can use this to give people time to disarm the zone before the output relays are triggered. Now, if you're arming on an input and not on a schedule, you can set down the countdown buzzer to match the arming delay as well. Okay, I'd just like to take a minute to look at the inputs and outputs and how they're used in event-to-action configurations. Now, for example, here we have a virtual zone set up for a gate. We're using one of the inputs from an access control unit to trigger the active state on the zone. This input could be connected to a button on a guard station overlooking the parking lot, or an exit button at a lot gate. When this input is closed, it will trigger the custom event we have set up, shipping gate open. From here, we can set up an action based on the event, which will trigger the lock to output on the access control unit. Setting it to an active state tells the gate to open, but we can also use other output behaviors, which we'll just take a look at down here. So just to give you another example, the output behaviors we'll cover at the next slide. I just want to give you another example down here. So if we have the door monitor input configured on a door, basically the system will be able to detect when the door has been forced open and will generate an event based on this. Here we see the door forced open event. From this event, we can set up an action to send an email to Security Center user group members and set it on a schedule to only send the email when the offices should be closed, such as their major holidays. So that's the schedule there, and that's the recipient here. It's our security user group. And you give a description as well to in the email to say exactly what has happened. Okay, so I mentioned the output behaviors. You can use the two that are there by default, or you can create your own to suit a particular purpose. Now you find the output behaviors in the system task under the output behavior section. Now the two defaults are active and normal, which set the output in the active position indefinitely or sets the output back to the normal condition. Now if you create additional output behaviors, you can specify what type of behavior you want to perform on the output. There are three types of them here, starting with the state, which is our basic active or normal indefinite state change. You can also specify a delay to say how long it waits until it changes the state. Now the next one here is pulse, which we have an example here, which also has a delay before it sets the output to an active state, and then returns it to normal at the end of the output behavior duration, and that's also configurable. The last one is periodic, which is a cycle that can be set up. You can set the delay before it starts, the duration, which is how long you want the cycle to run for, and you can also set that to infinite using the checkbox right below it there, and then the percentage of the cycle to be active and how long each cycle period is. So basically, if you take a look at the graph down here, you can see the duration is 4 seconds. That's this whole entirety here. The cycle is 50%. We've got a delay of half a second right here. and the period is 1 second. So it's taking half of that time will be active, and then it resets it back to its normal condition. Now once we have these defined, you can use these output behaviors anytime you're triggering an output in Security Center. Okay, for our last section today, I want to take a look at badge templates and how to create one using the Badge Designer. So taking a look at the main Badge Designer screen here, we have our front and back sections of the templates, and the units and measurements on the bottom here with our expandable toolbars on the side. There's the units and measurements there. Now these are all expandable, and I've included them on top here, each one. We're going to take a few minutes and we're going to go over each one of the toolbars and how to use these various options. So let's start with the main one you're going to use a lot, the Tools section. The major creation tools we have here are for rectangles, ovals, text, pictures, and barcodes. Creating a rectangle or oval is pretty simple. You just click on the tool and drag out the size and shape of the oval or rectangle that you want. Now you have handles on the sides for scaling, and the green handle on top here is for rotation. Now if you right click on the shape, it brings up a menu with the typical copy and paste options, as well as the Z order, which can be used to place objects in front or behind of others in case you have an overlap. You'll also see a border option, which I've expanded right here, where you can choose the thickness, or you can choose to have no border on the shape whatsoever. The text tool here is pretty flexible and can be used to put static text on a card or pull information from Security Center. Now once again, you'll just need to drag out the size of the text box, right click on the box, and choose the properties, which will bring up this window here. You'll be able to enter static text, such as the first name part that we've got right here. You can also use the drop-down menu to see the Security Center fields you can add. These will show up in curved brackets, such as the first name section right here. Now any custom fields you have added for the cardholders or credentials will show up in this list as well. So once you have that list expanded, just double-click on the field and it's going to populate the text box where the cursor is. When the badge template is assigned to a card credential, it will display the value associated with the cardholder or the credential. Now right-clicking on the text box brings up some familiar options like the copy and paste, the Z order, and the border as well here. We also have options to set the font, the text color, the alignment of the text within the box, such as center or left justified, and we can pull the properties up from here again. The font and text color are very common pop-ups, so you should recognize those. So the last two options are for pictures and barcodes. For pictures, drag out the size of the picture you'd like to show, and from the properties, you can choose to show the cardholder's picture, or you can choose a picture from your hard drive. You can choose to have the picture stretch over the size of the box as well, either proportionally or filling the entire box. For barcodes, once again, you just drag out the field as well, but there are a lot more properties to configure. Now the text is what will be displayed within the barcode, and you can choose which value to bind the barcode to right here. This is the value that will be encoded on the barcode itself. You can also use the check digit or show the barcode footer, and you can set up what barcode type that matches your barcode readers that have been installed. Okay, let's move on and quickly touch on the other toolbars on the side. The brushes toolbar is used to define the fill and border color of the shape we have selected. Clicking on the brush field will allow you to choose the color graphically, or enter the values in manually for more precision. As you can see, we have our RGB values here, or you can put it in hex code right here as well. And as well, we have the slider for the opacity, which is basically to make it more transparent. Now as well, if you take a look here, we have an X next to either one, in case you do not wish to have a fill color or a border on that shape. Now the format here is the actual size of the card, and has several common defaults set up here. If you need to use something else, you can select the custom size, and it'll bring up this pop-up menu here. From here you just need to give it a name and drag the sliders to the appropriate size. Below here we also have the option to set up the cards using the landscape or portrait orientation. Now the last one down here is our import and export badge template buttons right here. This is to use the template on another security center system or for creating backups if you need to. So just to take a look at a quick example, this is one I created in landscape format. And on the front, I just wanted to show the card holder picture here with the company logo and the name of the card holder as well as their position, which is a custom field here. Now on the back is a static image and the name of the division. This badge template would only apply to card credentials used by the video team of the GTAC. So here's how the card would actually look when selected in the card holder management tool, showing the real information based on the card holder. The name, the position, the card holder picture, and as you can see, all of that is static there. Alright, so that concludes the webinar for today. We're going to leave the session active for about another 10 minutes or so in case you have any additional questions for Roger, Scott, or myself. In case any of your coworkers missed the webinar, we're going to have the video posted on the GTAP in the next couple of days. If you have any comments or feedback on the webinar, we'd love to hear it. When you close the webinar session, you'll be presented with a short survey. If you could just take a minute to drop a few comments in there, we'd greatly appreciate it. Now, if you can think of anything you'd like to ask or have any other comments, you can leave those in the GTAC Tech Talk section of the GTAP forum. We'll also have the general questions and answers from today's webinars as well as links to the videos posted in the forum soon. One other thing we're going to post in there as well is a link to the slides in a read-only format in case you'd like to review them yourself. So once again, thank you very much for attending our GTAC Tech Talk webinar, and we hope you all have a great day.